Okay, welcome back, American History students. This is Chapter 11, Section 3. The focus of this section is kind of like how life was during wartime for certain groups of people. We'll start off with African Americans and how the Civil War kind of changed their life. They play a pretty important role in the Civil War. And while there were only 1% of the population of the North was African Americans, about 10% of that population actually participated in the Civil War. So, pretty high representation of that group. Now, most of these were former slaves. They were African Americans who had come up from the South and were now living free in the North, and they had a lot of family members back home. So, they really had something to fight for. They were wanting to end this foul institution of slavery, and they wanted to be able to do it on the battlefield. Okay. Now, most of them suffered a lot of discrimination, even in the North. They were still very discriminated against, just no slavery in the North. Most white people didn't think that they made good soldiers, that they were really only good for kind of shovels and picks and stuff like that. But they also had to serve in separate regiments, so they weren't allowed to fight beside other white people in the North, which is kind of ironic when you think about it, that by 1863, the North is fighting to free slaves, yet they look at black people and say, but we don't think you're worthy to fight alongside us. You need to fight in your own little groups. They weren't paid as much. A typical Union soldier made about $13 a month. Black soldier in the Union only made about $10 a month. They would eventually protest that, and by the end of the war would get that equalized and would actually make as much money as their fellow white soldiers. They had very high mortality rates. A lot of this had to do with the fact of where they were stationed. They were stationed in these large garrisons, again, mostly because they didn't think they made good soldiers, which is pretty false, obviously. But they were in these large garrisons with a lot of people, and so disease spread very rapidly. Disease kills more people than bullets in the Civil War. Disease is always a big deal when it comes to warfare. So African Americans suffered pretty high mortality rates because of these diseases. Another reason our mortality rates was pretty high was how they were treated in battle. Um, it, Southerners, Confederates would take white prisoners, but they hardly ever took black prisoners. They would usually execute them, which obviously is murder when you look at it. So they were treated very differently than their fellow white soldiers. There was also a very infamous account at Fort Pillow. In that account, Southerners had taken over the fort, and there were African American soldiers there, and they murdered over 200 of them. Basically, made them drop to their knees and shot them in the head. Pretty gruesome stuff, really, and definitely outside the rules of warfare, if you will. In the end, even the South, as crazy as this sounds, even the South actually considered having slaves fight. And that's crazy. The slaves had been helping Southerners for a long time because they forced their slaves to dig the ditches and the trenches and carry bags of food and this and that. They weren't going to put guns in their hands, but things got so desperate towards the end of the war for the South that they were actually considering having slaves fight, which is kind of crazy to me. I don't know how that would have turned out for the Confederacy, but it was a consideration. Now, behind enemy line, well, I say behind, in the South, what was life like for slaves left on the plantation, sometimes without very much oversight because so many men were gone fighting in the war? Well, they had a lot of sabotage going on. They were breaking equipment. They weren't working very hard. And because of this and because of the nature of the war, the plantation system is going to decline. It is well on its way out, even before the end of the war. Now, shifting gears, we want to talk a little bit about how the Civil War affected the economy, both the North and the South. And without a doubt, it affects the South much more negatively than it does the North. The South is going to experience inflation rates of about 7,000%, which is just an incredible number. The South had a lot of food shortages because of the Union blockade. If you remember, part of the Anaconda Plan was to blockade the South. The South could grow food, but they weren't growing food. Remember, they're growing cotton, a cash crop, and cotton, you can't put that in your belly. So they actually weren't growing as much food as what the North was growing. So food shortages was a big deal, and a lot of that brought on because of the Union blockade. It got to the point towards the middle and towards the end of the war where some Southerners were smuggling cotton on a black market to Northerners in exchange for food. Things got pretty lean and pretty desperate in the South during the Civil War. Remember, the war's being fought in the South. The South is going to be the one that suffers the devastation of the Civil War. Now, up north, it's a little bit different. Many industries are awarded military contracts, which make them very wealthy. So you got these business owners, these owners of industries that are becoming fat cats, getting super rich because of this war. They're actually benefiting from this war. However, in the North, wages, how much they're paying their employees, are not matching the prices. Prices are going up in the North because of the war, yet people aren't getting paid as much. The owner is getting more money because he's got more business and more money coming in, but he's not passing that on to his employees, keeping their wages the same. And so standard of living in the North for many people will actually decrease because of the war. In 1863, right in the middle, it's been 2 years since 1861 and the start of the war, the Union government passes an income tax law. And so they begin taxing people's income, how much money they're making. And that helped them pay for the war. Versus the South, who's going to try to pay for the war through making more money, which is one of the reasons that the inflation rate shoots up so high, and it was just devastating for the Southern economy. Now, soldiers themselves on both sides of this conflict suffer tremendously, but without a doubt, Southern soldiers suffered a little bit more because there were many times that they didn't have proper shoes, and you're out there in the winter marching around in the snow and stuff. It kind of harkens back all the way to Revolutionary days. They just didn't have the industries to put out the boots, to put out the socks, to put out the clothing that the North had. The North always going to have those blue uniforms and stuff, and the South was technically gray, but a lot of times, Southern soldiers just wore what they could because they didn't have uniforms. Times got so lean. They suffered through lice and diarrhea, extreme diarrhea, the kind that can kill you, dysentery, all these diseases that these soldiers on both sides are suffering through, being pushed together in these large numbers. Contaminated water, stuff like that. A couple of women you need to know that were very important in this time period. One is Dorothea Dix. She's about 60 years old during the Civil War. She is named the superintendent of nurses. And prior to this, Dorothea Dix was very famous for being a reformer. She was the one that said, hey, you can't put mentally insane patients in prison with rapists and murderers. They're different. And so she kind of set up mental asylums. She started reforming schools and reforming prisons and all these things. So a very impressive woman, especially for her time period. So she taught soldiers, her and her staff of nurses, taught soldiers better hygiene, which led to fewer deaths from things like dysentery. Another very famous woman in this time period was Clara Barton. She served as a nurse, but she served on the front line. She's right out there, think about this, with no guns, right out there on the front line. She was often known as the angel of the battlefield. A lot of bravery to be out there fighting in this and to not even be wielding a weapon. So she certainly makes an enormous mark there. And the last little bit that we want to talk about right here is prisons. Both prisons for both sides are just terrible. They're very bad. The prisoners are treated not in a good manner. But without a doubt, Southern prisons are far worse than Northern prisons are. Probably because the South suffered more. They're not going to waste a lot of food feeding Union soldiers when they can barely eat themselves. And so if we'll get out there and hopefully we'll see some of these, but in class. But there are pictures out there. It looks like the Holocaust. You have Union soldiers who, might weigh 70 pounds, that you can see the ribs and all the bones in their body because they've basically been starved. And that's how bad some of these prisons were. And you had prison exchanges. Sometimes, Southerners would exchange, 30 Union soldiers for Southern soldiers that were captured by Union forces. And so you had an interesting dynamic that went on here during the Civil War. So that's your big focus for this section, the economy and how the Civil War affected people's lives during this 4-year monumental struggle. And we'll see you again in section 4.